that kind of our series kind of close this prayer. I'm going to give a brief summary of my thoughts about and then we can on how to translate. Tonight we'll look at the words of good as pre-evoked in emotional state as opposed to text or interpretation. We will examine aesthetic factors of prayer that impact the emotional aspect of Torah, including the inherently subjective nature of good aesthetics. And we will conclude with some suggestions for contemporary worship spaces. So last week I argued for a methodology of interpreting prayer called the literary intertext method. If the major roadblock to a more meaningful prayer life is the connection to the words, then I noted we have basically three options. We can cut the words, we can rewrite the words, or we can interpret the words. For the reasons I fleshed out last week, I clearly favor the third option. Constructing a method of interpretation is juxtaposing the prayer text to the biblical community. This methodology calls for examining the text through the surrounding biblical context, seeing that biblical context through the eyes of Chazal, and then reading that back to the prayer itself. And this, I argued, could open up multiple interpretations of the words on the page and not just a flatline understanding of the supposedly simple meaning. Or to state it another way, using Heschel's terminology, it is an example of a sympathetic prayer book execution. But any of the solutions that we consider, cutting, rewriting, or interpreting, fundamentally assume that the problem is a cognitive one. It means I can't say the words because I don't believe them, or I can't connect to them, or I don't understand them. This is, in fact, how Mordechai Kaplan and Eugene Cohen stated the problem in the introduction to the first reconstruction of Siddur that was published in 1945. It's incredible language, so note the way they link the intellect and the emotion as keeping intertwined. Text number 1 and the first Oh, it's starting Jewish tradition. Okay. Since the traditional service has not sufficed to preserve the spirit of worship among Jews, we have found it necessary to suggest new forms of Jewish liturgical expression. Only such a restatement can awaken in the heart of the modern-minded Jew the desire to worship. The terms liturgical expression and statement in mind blur together with notable such as spirit, heart, and desire. The implication is clear. To arouse the desire to worship, to awaken the heart, the words must be restated. Surely, for some, the intellectual block is the critical issue. But what is the crisis of prayer in such a culture is not ultimately related to intellectual objection to the words. Since prayer is so much more than the words on the page, it seems to me that the revitalization of prayer I may arrive at a different place of connection, but fundamentally, I may not be connecting to the worship experience itself. Now, in his seminal work, The Non-Verbal Language of Prayer, Uri Ehrlich, who's a contemporary scholar at Ben Gurion, makes the point that prayer is much more than the words of prayer. So, he says, verse number 3, although undeniably a fundamental component, the text in and of itself is only partial expression to the full import of the prayer act. Using this broader perspective, the liturgical poignants are not just literary compositions, but rather texts placed in the mouths of worshipers standing before their Creator in prayer. It's not just about the text, it's about the people saying that in the church. It's aimed at establishing a living dialogue between individuals and God. As these factors shape the holistic nature of the prayer act, it's essentially the prayer. The venue of worship, the number of prayers recited in a common day, the worshiper's emotional mood, attire, voice, gestures, and action. So clearly, Ehrlich has an understanding of prayer that goes beyond interpreting the words on the text and goes beyond the solution that's suggested by Kaplan and Cohen about how to deal with the modern problem of worship. Now, this understanding of prayer obviously predates the contemporary scholar Ehrlich. As you noted last week, Larry Hoffman devoted an entire book that was called Beyond the Text to the holistic element of prayer, going beyond the page of prayer. But really, what the classic formulation of this understanding of prayer is also called Chazal. I want to look at this from what it means to approach prayer from an emotional standpoint as opposed to from an intellectual standpoint. There's a pasuk in Deuteronomy that states this is first on the board. והיה אם שמוע תשמעו על מצוותיי אשר אנוכי מצווה אתכם היום. ואהבת השם אלוקיכם ולעובדו בכל לבבכם ובכל נפשכם. We are enjoined to love God, your God, and to serve God with all your heart and with all your soul. All of us can call out. You are probably familiar with those words from another context in the Shema. Now, the interpretation of that text gets at the distinction between what we're calling the intellectual side of prayer and the emotional side. The question is asked in this story that appears a number of places in the Bible. They ask on the verse, to love your God and to serve God with all your heart. What is the service of the heart? What does it mean to serve with your heart? That is prayer. So there's some connection between the idea of emotion, reading lev as a standard for the larger concept of emotion that is inextricably linked to prayer. If you're not working on the emotions in prayer, it's not actually prayer. You're not engaging your heart. If you're just going through an intellectual exercise of interpretation, you're not actually arriving at what is happening. So in contrast to that, book, to the words of prayer, we lay down a more intellectual scripture. And to look at the ways in which the words themselves can be a tool not only to an intellectual openness, but also to an emotional expansiveness. Now, there's a big problem with this subject, and I'll mention here, Hoffman traces the idea of the numinous, which really first made its appearance in a book called The Idea of the Holy by a German philosopher named Rudolf Otto. He makes a point between the numinous to, quote, more and minus the rational aspect altogether. This means that we're talking about something that's holy that goes beyond equating religion with effort, or even equating religion with demanding at all. Otto argued, and Hoffman fleshes this out in his analysis. He says, and this is in text number 7, words in prayer were not always introduced to convey information about reality. The very words were often the goal. The mind is free from normal systems. So that is the key. True, these mantras are not things of totally meaningless things, but they are mantras nevertheless. In that otherwise meaningful words are used in meaningless ways. I want to say that again. Meaningful words are used in meaningless ways. That is, the standard translation do follow the normal rules of speech. That's translated what we see structurally flat. But there's functions relevant to that. That's the whole point of the word their positive content is not allowed to improve upon their rhythmic aspect. The idea of rhythm is purely the using words to get at action and I'm trying to describe reality, I'm not trying to describe God through adjectives, I'm trying to go somewhere with my emotions. So the same words that we were using as an interpretive window last week, we're now using to go into non-context. Now, let me illustrate this with a couple of examples. The fundamental problem is the opposite of the door is a unitary door. Right? If you look at it as a opposition, where the whole goal is to pray. But when you look at this door carefully, you'll notice that it's made up of many, many different types of text. And here I'm not even talking about the period of the writing of the text, but just the style of the text. And it's markedly different from page 1 to page 1,000. And I'll sort of give an example of this that hopefully will illustrate it. There is the concept of a short blessing. Let's take the example of Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. right? What's the goal when I say, blessed are you, God, who brings forth bread from the land? Or how are we going to translate lechem? You are blessing God for the benefit of my way. Now, you can supplicate this more. What does it mean that bread that comes out first? After all, bread doesn't come out of you. The grain comes out. Bread is a more human, involvement in that process. And one could perform the method that we used last week to take a look at the biblical context. For instance, noting that lechem min haaretz is actually a portion of Kuf Daled, and that one could then understand the biblical context of that song, Chazal's interpretation of that song, and come up with a different understanding of what Hamotzi is about. But fundamentally, it's about thanking God for bread, right? That's pretty much where we're going. That's not the type of prayer that often is about in these three forms that moves towards the mind. And here I want to give an example that I brought to you on the next page, on page 3. This is a line that's taken out from the first blessing of the blessings that precede the Kriyat Shema. And I'm just going to read it in the Hebrew to sort of make a point about what it's getting at. Hamelech amromam levado me'ai, hamishubach v'hamifa'ar v'hamitnasei mimot olam. And now to translate it, and you see how translation obviously loses the entire power here. The king, exalted alone since then, me'az, praised, glorified, and elevated since the world began. Now, this phrase, as I said, this is about the theme of life. But you'll notice that this sentence has very little to do with life. In fact, it seems like one of those sentences that you saw in the Samina last week objected to when the Chazan started to add adjectives in describing God. And we had that text of Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah, the great, mighty, and awesome God, Ha'adir VaChazak VaAmitz. He added 3 more adjectives trying to get at God's power. Well, what are we accomplishing when we say Mishubach, Mifo'ar, Mitnasei, Mimot Olam? What kind of reality am I trying to do here? How can I describe God? It's a failed project. So it's interesting to think about the way in which this line was interpreted by scholars of liturgy. Jewish liturgy, and in fact, wrote a book called Jewish Liturgy, which is the last really comprehensive, total view of liturgy that we're able for today. It was translated in the 70s and then into the English in the 90s, but it was written in 1917 in the German. He looks askance at this whole line. It's actually quite amazing to look at the way in which he treats it. He writes that this section, including this line, quote, adds nothing new to the ideas that were meant to be expressed. It is merely an artificial expansion that might be deleted without loss to the content. Okay? Now, he later called this an unnecessarily wordy transition. And indeed, if I'm someone who is sympathetic to the German Reform movement and I'm looking for places to cut, why not start with this? It has nothing to do with light. It's repetitive. The whole idea of describing God with adjectives is a failed project. It's wordy. Let's get rid of it, right? What could possibly be the point of this line? But maybe the adjectives are not, as Hoffman suggests, intended to convey information so much as to create a mantra experience. Look at the line again. The letter mem, shows up in almost every word of the line. And you're left with this experience of a... Now, what are we doing with that sound? World religions have used the sound to induce some sort of trance. I want to look at one of the examples before we draw some sort of implications for this. Reuven Kimmelman, the scholar I mentioned last week from Brandeis, notes this about another phrase that's in the same section of this song, which you'll see in the next verse, verse number 7. וכולם פותחים את עינם בשתיקה ובטהרה, בשבירה ובזמרה. ומברכים ומשבחים ומפארים, מעריכים ומרקישים וממליכים. Hashem ha'el ha'melech ha'gadol ha'gidol v'hanarach ha'veshu. Now, I'm reading it in Hebrew, and I'm reading it kind of fast on purpose. Because what are we trying to get at with this line from the liturgy? It's more than information about reality. It's more than description of God. It's sound, right? Open mouth. And then you're in the barch and shavim, right? You get the sort of the rhythm of the mem surrounded words is creating a sound experience as opposed to a intellectual experience of what it means to praise God.
Now, I'm not saying that the words don't mean that God is being praised, but it's an interesting overlap between the meaning of the words from an intellectual standpoint and the sound of the words. If you imagine, Kimmel makes this point, what are the sounds of the angels? Right? The sounds of the flapping of the wings of the angels could sound like that, right? A lot of sort of consonantal noise, as it were, that's coming from the angels. Either way, it certainly sounds different than the blessing over bread. Right? You can see how the liturgy is trying to do something different here than the line about blessing God for bread of the earth. Indeed, as Hoffman writes, he says, the theologically disparate concept signifying words, kadosh and baruch, often appear interchangeably in Merkava liturgy. We'll get to that in a second. Since their normal meanings in the holy expression are irrelevant to a liturgical experience that presented words for purposes of their rhythm, their song, their affect, not their sensuality or their dictionary time to listen. Right? When you say that we are are those distinct ritual acts? Does blessing God mean something different from sanctifying God? Well, it might, but not in this passage. Right? In this passage, Hoffman says, there's synonymous. Now, as I noted last week, the tools of philology and form criticism can actually be useful in serving a religious end and not necessarily in a textual investigative end only. Philologists will note that both of these excerpts from the Blessing of Kriyat Shema do not appear in many recensions of the liturgy, including both the public and the private chapters of the private liturgy. And it's also missing in many of the Geneva texts. But as detected from the comments of Ellbogen, the value of discovering the origin of such a text is diminished for the reasons that I'm going to discuss today. Heinemann and the form critics might take this information and instead of trying to postulate about the original words of the Shema blessing, speak of the provenance of such a line. In other words, where does this come from? I can't necessarily say that this line is later because it's not in all the texts, and I want to try to reconstruct the original blessing of the Shema. Maybe I want to understand, where did this line come from? What is the institutional locus of this kind of a line? And there we get into the whole area that is incredibly impactful on Tefillah, which is the early understanding of mysticism in Jewish thought. That is to say, there is a deep and long-running school of mystical prayer that we see already in the Talmud, and that runs throughout Jewish history, taking its certain form in Kabbalah and Chassidut as we move to the modern period. Now, suffice it to say that a scholar like Ellbogen could care less about mysticism. Living in the environment that he was living in, mysticism was essentially an embarrassment to what it means to be a good Jewish cultured person, right? If you're trying to convince non-Jews of the value of your religion, you're not going to go around saying, well, the religion's really built on a series of syllables called right? That doesn't fly in rational Germany. So that's why he's willing to just simply cut this text without any mourning. But it's not the case that our Tannaitic ancestors were living in 19th century Germany, and they may have indeed seen a value to writing a text like this. Now, there's a whole massive debate about when this mystical school was originated, who was actually in it. Does it go back to the Tanaim who were mentioned as saying these words, or is it much later? All this is something for another lecture entirely. But suffice it to say that the source of these kinds of lines is found in other clearly mystical texts. And just to bring that home, I'm going to look at the text in text number 12, written by Meir Bar-Ilan, the title is The Mysteries of Jewish Prayer and Connecting Hechalot, which is the mystical tradition, with Jewish prayer. And he brings this very, very long text, which is actually also in the same section of Shema. And in one part of it, there are 23 mini lines that start with the mem. Okay, so you get an extreme mem, sort of, an overwhelming experience of mem. So listen to this. I'll just read the last two of those 23. Melech, mamlich, melachim, melech, meshubach, umfoar. Right, so first of all, you have the complete overlap between meshubach and umfoar. But you also have the mem. Right? You have this sense that the mystics were trying to get at something through syllables. Okay, now, what does it mean to have a mystical approach to the Siddur? What does it mean to look at the Siddur with an eye for the mystical text? It means opening up the possibilities of what texts are doing in the Siddur. Again, last week we're talking about how could I interpret text that I have a problem with or that I don't connect to. Now I'm asking you, well, how did you connect to this line before? And am I opening up another avenue by saying, you know what? It's not meant to connect to your intellect. It's meant to connect to your emotions, to affect. So think about some of the other areas where the mystical influence is clear. And you can think about it not only by the repetition of syllables, but by the repetition of words, right? Ein Keloheinu. That little ditty we sing at the end, right? Now, there's a whole history to the editing of Ein Keloheinu and what the acronym is supposed to spell out. There's different orders to Ein Keloheinu, but fundamentally, what are you doing in Ein Keloheinu? You're saying a lot of words that rhyme over and over again. And indeed, forms of Ein Keloheinu show up in mystical texts all over. Yistabach, which has 15 synonyms for praise. Why do we need to praise God so many times? Wasn't the first time enough? Well, not if we're talking about inducing a particular state. Yishmach, that we say on Shabbat, and Shabbat itself was a favorite time for the mystics to really go wild in terms of creating poetry like this. And even Aleinu. There's a mystical text of Aleinu. It's actually, instead of Aleinu l'shabeach, starts off Alai l'shabeach, and it's put in the mouth of Rabbi Akiva, which comes right in the middle of all the mystical texts that have been collected, most recently by Peter Schaeffer. But what would your understanding of Aleinu move towards if you looked at it not simply as perhaps a triumphalist or at least distinguishing the Jews and non-Jews one to another, but some sense of accessing the mystical experience of God? A key word here is Yotzer Bereshit, which is a favorite God term of the Bible. In short, you can think of any text in the literature that has a heaping on of adjectives. Think of the Kaddish also, right? If you go back far enough, you're going to find some parallels. So when you're getting to the repetitive mode, you're moving into the mystical mode. Now, as an aside, I want to say that this might actually offer some new information about that debate between Rabbi Hanina and the Chazan, who went on a little bit long by adding the adjectives. Was the Chazan trying to describe God as Rabbi Hanina claimed he was, and therefore dismissed his action? Or did the Chazan actually try to access a different mode of prayer that Rabbi Hanina wasn't supportive of, that he defeated intellectually? There's no philosophical justification for adjectives with God, associating adjectives with God. But there may be some justification for saying 6 adjectives with God if I'm trying to induce some sort of emotional affect. And therefore, Rabbi Hanina, who gets the last word, may have simply been opposed to this piling on of adjectives, this approach to the affect as opposed to the more intellectual. In any case, recognizing the mystical goal of reading the work of the Siddur has very practical implications on the performance of prayer and the questions relate to the project of prayer, and I'm going to mention 2 of them here. Now first, as I sort of briefly alluded to, there's the objection of prayer as repetitive, right? Especially in its praise of God. When Elbogen says this is unnecessarily wordy. But as a mantra-inducing formula, you really have a different approach to repetition. Why still go on so long? Because we're trying to get somewhere information. And we can't do that by saying one word. The second, it raises the question of translation. What does it mean to try to translate a mystical text that's moving towards the affective side of the brain? Right? When I could if I don't translate it with some corresponding syllable approach to the words, have I lost the total meaning of that text? Or have I at least reduced it to only its intellectual access and have completely skipped over the emotional gateway? Now, us moderns, and I use the term broadly, and we're in postmodern age, may be uncomfortable with a prayer space that has a goal of skirting the intellect as opposed to engaging it, right? In other words, this is what's appealing to Kaplan and Cohen's approach, which is to say, why should I leave my intellect at the door when I'm praying these texts before I say the Shema? And I'm not suggesting that the limits of the mystical prayer are super mantras, but to say, to substitute the Siddur over the phone book and achieve the same effect, right? That's not what I'm arguing. But as with my approach to interpretation, I think there's something to the multiplicity of the use of words that's important to note here. Words can mean not only the simple surface level meaning, and not only the interpretive but also the affective. And how open are we to all 3 of those approaches to prayer, as opposed to just only one of them at any given time? Until now, we've uncovered an alternate goal for certain prayers based on their form. That is to say, mystical prayers that make use of alliteration and sound have a totally different core objective than other prayers trying to convey concepts. But what about a non-cognitive interpretive system, right? Last week we opened up the literary approach to interpretation. But what if I'm going to take a text that was in fact more on the Hamotzi Lecha Min Haaretz side of the ledger, but I'm going to bring a non-cognitive interpretive strategy to deal with it, right? This is actually an approach to the Siddur that was originated by Hasidei Ashkenaz. These 12th century mystics who were living in the sort of Germanland area, who took the Siddur and radically reinterpreted it in a way that nobody had ever done before. It's somewhat challenging for us to access that, but I want to explore it as a way of opening up the world to another dimension of what it means to encounter the Siddur. So you can see the approach here in text number 13. Ashkenazi Hasidim, Hasidei Ashkenaz, would see only rows of figures and numbers mystically connected. This new attitude has two results. A, no change can be tolerated in the text of the prayers, not even a minute one, because every change, even of one letter, would destroy the numerical harmony inherent in the text. It does not matter, therefore, whether the change is beneficial from the point of view of meaning and content, right? Kaplan's whole approach of, I need to edit the text to make it more agreeable to our modern sensibilities, that's meaningless. So this level of meaning is not the most important one in the prayers. The text is formed to reflect mystical harmony, and any change will destroy it. So you can't change the text because the text is actually a mystical string of letters. That's point number one. And point number two, the liturgy itself received new importance and new meaning within the framework of religious practice. A completely new dimension was added in this way to the daily practice. It stopped being just a reciting of self and speaking of God's ancient form, and became a vehicle for becoming a participant in a mystical divine harmony. Now, what would it mean to take an interpretive approach to the Siddur, where you essentially are saying it's not about what the meaning of the prayer is at all. It's actually about giving a mystical understanding of the combination of letters that takes precedence over the meaning. That's radical, right? That's a big move, okay? Started in 12th century, one string, one quote, because it's not something that we're necessarily familiar with, but it deals with it in a logical way. So the prayer that we use to end the series of brachot is Ga'al Yisrael, redeemed Israel, and it ends with a little poem. You know, if you notice it was a poem, but it is a poem with a rhyme in the last Shor Yisrael. Shema Be'ezrat Yisrael. V'kedei chaninecha Yuda B'Yisrael. Go'aleinu Adonai Tzebaot Shemo Kadosh Yisrael. Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael. Yisrael rhymes with Israel. Perhaps a mantra experience as you're heading toward the Amidah. So at least the whole issue of playing with that last Yisrael and whether you say it out loud against that loud. So here's Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, the founder of this school. This is his comment on Shor Yisrael. He says, you'll find 14 words in this blessing, corresponding to the persons of Israel, when Israel was removed from Egypt. Then he goes after the people who were adding to the Siddur. In this, the French made a terrible mistake, not their first, right? For I heard that they add in Shor Yisrael, Go'aleinu Hashem Tzebaot Shemo Kadosh Yisrael. They add those 5 words. Now, he says that's a terrible mistake, because the whole point is to have a poem that has 14 words. And not only has 14 words, he says, for the 14 words and the 60 letters, because we're counting the words and the letters, of Shor Yisrael correspond to 600,000 who were redeemed from Egypt on the 14th of Egypt. Right? So what's my objection to editing the Siddur? Now, why did the French add in these 5 words? Not clear. Was it some intellectual objection to the word? Was it some kishut, some decoration to the poem that they wanted to add another line? Was something significant about that as a reference to another biblical source? Who cares? The bottom line is you messed up the numerology of the prayer, and now we have no sense of the meaning of 14 and 600,000. That's gone. Okay? So this is indeed a radical approach to the prayer book, both in a conservative approach, but I can't even add one letter. Okay? When I counted, I was 61 letters is added in the Torah and Sacks, right? So it's very conservative, right? But on the other hand, it's also often a new direct kind of purpose interpretation. The meaning of the words are tangential. And it's only the length and the numerical associations that matter. So we often stop at the whole concept of gematria, or numerical parallelism, denying any mystical value to it. We literally laugh when someone says gematria, this is this, and we're sort of creating connections that seem somewhat forced. But I really want to open this as a possibility of what it would mean to approach the Siddur in a radical way, where associations are not simply the cognitive ones that I can make from a biblical quote that is fairly obvious, but one that is esoteric. In other words, it's a super hyperlink. I have to get to the esoteric level of the prayer, match up the numbers to something else, and then I can leapfrog over to completely other concepts that I'm not otherwise able to access. What Yehuda Chassid goes on to do is to bring other prayers that have 14 words. And now all of a sudden, actually gets to your question from last week, do prayers link to other prayers? He's able to link prayers that you would have never come to from an exoteric or even an interpretive approach. Now, I want to use two other examples of this kind of interpretation of the words, just to get at some of the ways in which we experience davening, perhaps not only on the intellectual level. Now, one of them is Lecha Dodi, and the other is going to be Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre, Nyana Diyoma, but we'll start with Lecha Dodi. Now, I don't want to get into the multiple interpretations of Lecha Dodi, and you'll see that I just brought you the refrain of Lecha Dodi on page 3, text number 16, just to remind us. Lecha Dodi as trying to communicate some sort of Kabbalistic information is chock full. Trust me. Reuben Kimmelman wrote an entire book on basically 4 verses of Lecha Dodi, trying to untangle all the Kabbalistic understandings of these words. Now, it was a prayer that was written by a Kabbalist, right? So they're not imposing meaning on an otherwise non-Kabbalistic work. It actually was the fruit of a Kabbalist. This line, Lecha Dodi, actually was circulating in Kabbalistic circles beyond Alkabetz's particular poem that we know today, and you'll see why the power of this line is so important in a moment. So I'm not going to get into the question of who are all the characters in this line, right? Who is the bride? Who is the speaker? Is Shabbat the same as the bride? Why are we going out to greet the bride in the second one, and I'm telling you to go greet the bride in the first half? But fundamentally, those are all questions of Kabbalistic interpretation which are important to understanding the value, right? How many verses does Lecha Dodi have? Well, Lecha Dodi has 9 verses, and Lecha Dodi itself is the 10th, the refrain, right? That's itself a spherotic structure where you have a line that moves like a sphira between the other sphirot. Whether it's Malchut, whether it's the Ein Sof, is a whole question that you can consult your local Kabbalist. But I wanted to point out the matters wrapped up in the letters and the words here, just as an illustration of the way in which, take or leave Yehuda Chassid's approach, it does show up in certain prayers that's clear. So Lecha Dodi likrat kala penei Shabbat nikabala. You have 7 words, and that already, is at the level of your layman's Kabbalah. Okay, 7 words. This is the song I sing on the 7th day. You're getting to the 7 lower sphirot, perhaps. But now we're getting to the question of letters. How many letters are there in the line? 26. I'll do the counting for you. 26 is the same numerical value as Yud He Vav He, right? God's name, and not only God's name, but God's familiar name or intimate name, God's specific name to the Jewish people, but also a Kabbalistically rich name, right? Because what is the goal of Lecha Dodi? It's actually to unite things. Think of the first verse. Zachor v'shavor b'dibor echad. Hishmianu el hamiyuchad. Adonai echad u'shemo echad. Right? You're constantly getting some sort of unity that you're doing. The echad, echad, echad shows up in that first verse. But what is this line doing in terms of the letters? So you have 26 letters, which is the numerical value of God's name. But in the first half, you have 15 letters. And in the second half, you have 11 letters. That is to say, Yud He and Vav He. Right? And the whole point of Lecha Dodi is you're taking separate things, Shamor v'Zachor, and you're bringing them together, B'dibor Echad. Right? So the 15 and the 11 unite to form the 26th letter name of God. Now, again, this is penned by a Kabbalist, so it's not a stretch to say that this was a purposeful writing of these words. You have 7 words, 26 letters divided into 15. And I would argue that it opens up a completely different understanding of a poem that, like I once heard as a teenager, was like a Zionist poem. It was like might as well have been written in 1940. Now there is, you can read it that way, right? Kumitzi, right? But there is some sense that if you don't get to the mystical side of it, you've kind of missed the boat. Now I want to bring this our attention lastly to Kol Nidre, because I think especially at this time of year, Kol Nidre has that ability to conjure up the images of standing at the entrance to Yom Kippur, whatever that brings for you, right? Whether it's dread or anticipation or some sort of seriousness or reflectiveness, those words are getting you somewhere. But what do the words actually mean? The words themselves are not actually in a I would say, high emotional content level, right? It's fundamentally a dissolution of vows, whether it's dissolution of your past vows or your future vows. You could see Rabbeinu Tam on that issue. But fundamentally, you're talking about a legal formula to get rid of vows, okay? That doesn't necessarily inspire me with awe. So why does Kol Nidre work as a prayer, right? There's a whole other, you can analyze that from many different aspects, including, let's say, the number of people, or perhaps most famously, the music, right? But if you go down the music route, and Joey is going to talk about this next week about the power of music, if you go down the music route, then you're basically making two edits to history. One, you're forgetting all the people who don't sing Kol Nidre to the familiar Ashkenazi tune. I'm saying familiar to me. And two, you're ignoring the fact that Kol Nidre was a beloved prayer, although sort of despised by the rabbis, in a time before the writing of that actual melody. So you have some power to Kol Nidre that precedes the melody or stands in parallel to the melody. So what is the power of Kol Nidre? Well, I want to argue that the power of Kol Nidre is actually something that comes in the words themselves as mysterious words. Now, the words are Aramaic, so even the Hebrew speaker can't necessarily access what it means to say Kol Nidre. But what is the word function? Well, you have all these repeating sounds. Nidre, esare, shivu'e, charame, koname, kinusei, chinuye, right? The A, and then you have all the nas. Din darnao, dishtabanao, dacharimnao, dasarna, al nashatana, right? So you have the A and the na. Now, A and na might not also get you to the level of dread, but it's at least moving you into a different place. And I think that part of our embarrassment around liturgy is often focused on the point of, I don't understand it. So it's not fair for me to have an emotional response. How could I get so worked up about Kol Nidre? I don't even know the meaning of the word after Kol, right? I can't get anywhere when I go into the intellectual side of things. And in fact, when I look at the Machzor and I start reading, I'm like, oh my God, what is this, right? But we're getting to some place because of the fact that it is a mysterious string of words. Now, there is a whole aspect of Kol Nidre which is reflected in its magical overtones, right? Kol Nidre, it was noticed already more than 100 years ago, has many words familiar with magical incantation bowls that were found in Babylonia, around the 8th century. These are bowls that were written for a, ritual magical purpose, which is to say, to cover up. They put the bowls upside down to cover up any evil force that might otherwise, escape the bowl. I'm thinking of using this for the mice problem that we have in our house. So, you have some sense of, well, if I could just cover the demon with this incantation and the physical bowl, I'm in the clear, right? Now, that's already something powerful around what it says, what it means to say these words. It drifts off into the area of magic, and the whole distinction between religion and magic is another massive topic for a lecture that we can't get into now. Suffice it to say that what is the power of a magical phrase? The power is the repetition, right? This sort of thing of saying a spell 3 times over, which indeed we do for Kol Nidre, right? Or the repetition not only of the spell, but of the words in the spell, right? Abracadabra, okay? Whether or not it has some Aramaic meaning is a whole other debate, but you have some sense of the sounds that are performing something. And when you get into that world, you're getting into an approach to language that actually skirts the cognitive entirely. That is to say, it's not that I'm mistranslating Melech, Mishubachum Fo'ar, exalted and praiseworthy king. I can't even translate it. Right? I'm not even at the level of translation. And I think that a current scholar, Patricia Cox Miller, makes this point very well in text number 18, Lahavdil, quoting Alice in Wonderland. When Alice encounters the whiffling and burbling Jabberwock, she remarks, "It seems very pretty, but it's rather hard to understand." It's a fantastic comment about general ritual approach. Alice's comment is insightful. Such linguistic play is difficult to understand, and that is precisely the point. The idea that words create a meaningful universe is, as a poet said, the supreme fiction, right? That words can actually create meaning in fiction. Language is phantasmal, not transparent to whatever reality might be. God seems to dwell in the making and unmaking of language, right? What if God is not actually something that I try to describe using language? What if God is actually something that is represented, to the extent you can represent it all, in the ways in which language is deficient, right? So only when I get something only confusing am I starting to approach what it might mean to relate to God. God is mysterious. God is not exoteric, right? What does it mean to actually experience the words of the liturgy as an analog to experience the mystery and not the open-facedness of an experience of the divine? Okay, thus ends the section of words and how I use words to get to a particular place in terms of an emotional side and not necessarily an intellectual side. I want to take this one step further and look at another aesthetic area which goes beyond the words or as tools through syllables, but actually to look at a related issue, which is the issue of volume and voice. Now, the performance of liturgy is critical to the liturgy itself. In other words, I can convince you that there's multiple ways of approaching a line in the Siddur, but unless you experience that line in the context of the worship space in some powerful way, you've blown it. Or as Heschel said, what I plead for is the creation of a prayer atmosphere. A prayer atmosphere goes beyond my own experience with the Siddur on my own individual journey, whether it's intellectual or emotional. A prayer atmosphere implies there's something going on in the room beyond my dialogue with the Siddur. Uri Ehrlich, in this book, Nonverbal Language of Prayer, devotes an entire chapter to vocality, or hakol, voice. Where he says basically something obvious about voice, which is shifts in intonation, stress, rhythm, or volume alter meaning. In addition, emotions such as joy, anger, or hatred can find expression through vocal meaning, even if the feeling in question has no outlet in verbal content. In other words, you can say words in a particular emotional delivery that gives it meaning without changing the words. I can say a sentence angrily, or I can say a sentence plaintively. There's no end to the way in which I can use my voice to alter the meanings of the word without changing any words. When recited by rote, or with intense concentration, or by a worshiper driven by urgent need, or by contentment with his lot, the same prayer sounds different, right? Prayer can sound different. That's the volume and stress at another level of what it means to have a different aesthetic prayer experience. Now, to illustrate this aspect of prayer specifically related to volume, I'm going to quote two opposing approaches. The first is found in the ordinances of the German Reformed temples of the 19th century, and they were really bothered by issues of decorum. And they found that the vocal expression of prayers to be central in maintaining that sense of prayer. I'm going to quote a few of these ordinances that were collected by a scholar at HTC, Jacob Pedafovsky, in his book, Prayer Book Reform in Europe. Okay, and we're in text number, help me out here, 21. The members of the congregation are reminded and ordered to follow the cantor's prayers quietly and silently. They must refrain from the illegal and cacophonous shouting, which so frequently disturbs peaceful and true devotion. That was back in 1810. Or the congregation must listen silently to the prayers recited by the cantor. By no means must they audibly pray together with him, let alone sing with him, from the 1850s. And finally, in 1874, during the recitation of the prayers by the cantor, as well as during the reading of the Torah portion, everybody must refrain from accompanying the recitation or the reading with his own singing or reading. That whole practice of ending the pasuk together, forget it, you're out, okay? Now, I'm going to contrast this with a story that was actually told to me by a chassid from the Karliner dynasty. He told me this story. The Karliners is a Hasidic group that is known for their screaming davening, okay? So a Misnagid went to the Karliner Rebbe and asked him, why do you scream when you pray? The Rebbe took a pen and jammed it into the Misnagid's hand. The Misnagid let out a scream. When you're in pain, you scream, said the Rebbe. Okay, now I can't think of two more diametrically opposed approaches to prayer. Now it's interesting, I don't know which of them you prefer, right? Do you want to be in the world in which it's completely decorous and nobody's making a peep? or do you want to be in a world in which you're surrounded by people who are being stabbed by the emotional pen, right? Both of them may not necessarily satisfy the middle ground which some of us find ourselves in. And this ultimately gets to the problem of aesthetics, right? Do you want to live back in the 1810 sanctuary of Reform Judaism? Well, if you don't really have an objective leg to stand on. That is to say, when you get to the aesthetic nature of anything, it's fundamentally moving into the subjective question of what is good davening environment, right? You can't say for all time and all peoples, loud davening is the way to go. Or for all time and all peoples, silent davening is the way to go. This is the problem with having sort of a triumphalist approach to aesthetics. I myself have learned my lesson on this. So I think that I think that the way in which we might approach these questions of aesthetics, especially as it relates to volume, is one in which we at least are recognizing the choices before us. It's interesting, the Rambam, when he lists in Hilchot Tefillah the items that are preventing but not necessarily ultimately problematic for Tefillah, he lists 8 different forms of aesthetics, including the issue of the voice, including bowing and standing, all these different ways of holding your body, of clothing. There's ways in which that I could enforce for all time and for all people. And that's a challenge to people who have a particular aesthetic bent, right? In other words, how can I get a community to pray if I can't convince you that mumbling is better than quietness, right? We can't agree on that in an objective way. So what does it mean to pray as a community? And that may be in a way in which you break down into the aesthetic groupings of people as opposed to the theological groupings of people. I go to this shtibel because I like to daven loudly. Or I go to this shul because I can sit and read, right? Those are different aesthetic approaches. I may be saying the same words or reading the same words, but I'm not necessarily joining other people in an intellectual grouping, but more in an aesthetic grouping. And you see this all the time, of course, when people say, well, I'm going to go to this synagogue which completely denies my gender or my approach to gender, but you know what? I like the way they daven, right? It's a cost that you pay when you're trying to live in a world where aesthetics matter, and you can't find your aesthetic fellow travelers in your ideological group. We're obviously trying to do something about that. Okay, so I want to basically look at the question of the issue of volume, looking at 2 fundamental prayers, just again raising the problem of objectivity around them, or at least problematizing them, and then I'm gonna offer some thoughts about davening, even in this world of subjective aesthetics, and we'll open it up for questions. So I wanted to look at the contrast between the instructions to read the Shema and the Amida. And I think I approach this by way of saying, yes, aesthetics are subjective. So let's at least see what Chazal had to say when they chose their aesthetics in their time and place. Now there's 2 texts that are basically fundamentally opposed when it talks about the laws of the Shema and the Amida from a volume standpoint. You have in text number 23, Hakorei et Shema v'lo hishmi'a le'ozno yatsa. Rabbi Yossi Omer lo yatsa. If you read the Shema v'lo hishmi'a le'ozno and you did not cause your ear to hear, you're yotze. You've done the Shema, but it's not ideal, right? That's the implication of yatsa. Or Rabbi Yossi says, no, lo yatsa. You haven't even accomplished the Shema if you haven't heard yourself say the words. So what's important for the Shema? Volume. Now it looks like I didn't bring the next text here, which is talking about the Amida, but I'll just read it to you here. Yachol yehei mashmiya kolo le'oznav, right? Peresh b'chana shene'emar b'chana hi midaberet al liba. There is an opposing approach. Is it possible that I could mashmiya kolo le'oznav, that I could make my Amida loud enough so that my ears could hear? No, I learned from Chana the opposite, right? Midaberet al liba, she was speaking to her heart. She was not even raising it to the level of volume where she herself could hear it, right? So you have mashmiya or hishmiya le'oznav as desirable for the Shema and forbidden for the Amida. Okay? Now, what does this say? I think that in some ways it talks about what it means to use volume for different types of prayer. Let's talk about the Shema first. Here's a classic case of what the 20th century philosopher and linguistic pioneer J.L. Austin was talking about when he described the performative utterance in his book, How to Do Things with Words, right? Austin says that words are not necessarily always a description of reality, as we've already learned from Hoffman and the emotional side of prayer, but in fact, you can actually accomplish something. He takes this example. I take this man to be my lawfully wedded husband. When I say that, I have done something, right? Something is changed in my status as it relates to another person. It's not simply a description, it's performing something, right? Or as Austin says, we see then that stating something is performing an act just as much as is giving an order or giving a warning, right? I'm stating a fact, but I'm actually doing something with that stating. And that's, in some ways, what we're doing with the Shema. What have we done with the Shema? We have accepted upon ourselves Ol Malchut Shamayim, right? Chazal understood the purpose of the Shema to say that I am accepting the yoke of heaven upon me, Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, when I say the words of the Shema. So Chazal comes up with the rule that you should say the Shema out loud, is also understanding the Shema itself as a performative utterance. If I don't say it out loud, I haven't accomplished it, right? And that's why Rabbi Yossi in the extreme form says, Lo Yatsa. Now, let's contrast that with the Amida. The Amida is not so much a performative utterance as an expression of an emotional state or desire. Now, how do we say the Amida? We whisper it. And here, too, I want to look at the possibilities for what does it mean to whisper, okay? Just like words, you can have multiple interpretations of volume and vocality. And I'll just offer a couple here. This is from, the world of the field of vocality, which is actually sort of a new academic field. Mary Richardson was really the pioneer in this field, and she wrote a book called Paralanguage and Kinesis. Whispering, of course, is well known to be the medium of secret. In embarrassment, the voice may dwindle to a whisper. As a sign of respect, it is reported in other areas of the world. In one of the Naga tribes of India, where the ceremonial marriage is very formal, all the talking must be in a whisper when the bride and procession enter the bridegroom's house. So we can see here clearly that depending on the culture, the meaning of whispering is different. Am I embarrassed? Is it a formal moment? Is it something where I'm actually telling you a secret? Or is it a sign of respect, right? That's something that is open for interpretation. Now the Zohar has their own approach to what it means to whisper. I'll go into that for 1 second because it's interesting to see that overlay on our Amida. That is why the prayer is said in a whisper, says the Zohar, like someone speaking in secret with the king while he is closeted with him. The king will not leave him. In other words, there's some expression of intimacy that's being communicated when I whisper. If I'm whispering, you're not that far, you're right near me. Therefore, when the redemption prayer is joined to the 18 benedictions, Gal Yisrael to the Shemona Esrei, you should take hold of him and speak with him in subdued tones, in secret, so that he should not leave you or forsake you. The whole idea of whispering is a way of actually holding God close, right? That's a very powerful interpretation of what it means to say something in a particular mode, as opposed to the Shema, where I'm saying something in a much louder mode. But fundamentally, I would say that the way in which we get to the aesthetic understanding of the Amida is ultimately the biblical text that stands behind it. And here we have, going back to the Tosefta, the biblical character who is actually reciting the Amida as the model for us in this whispered manner is Chana. What is Chana? Chana is distraught about the place in which she is vis-a-vis her ability to have children. Right? She is in an emotional state in which, in fact, words have failed her. The only experience that she's had up until this moment is the sort of supposedly comforting words of her husband, Elkanah, who says, well, aren't I better to you than 10 sons? Right? That's a word expression meant to convey some information that completely falls flat for Chana. Chana moves beyond a word solution to a nonverbal solution in her approach to the divine. Now, we could imagine that the emotional state of Chana is perhaps a model for how we should see the way of performing the Amida, or at least the way of speaking quietly, or of whispering, or of moving our lips in a plaintive manner. That is very different from the way in which we could see the Shema, which in most cases. So you're moving, from one mode to the other in quick succession. Now, before I mark about the shifts, I just want to say something about the way in which even these very clear modes of loud for the Shema and quiet for the Amida became complicated over time. And again, it gets to the problem of objectivity when you get to aesthetics. Now, Rav Hai Gaon, who dies in 1038 and was the last of the leader of the Gaonim, he had an approach to the Shema that was actually very different from the way in which we might derive from our Tosefta. Rav Hai basically says that the Shema itself should be said in a whispered tone. He actually uses that word, sorry, where is it? I'm not seeing it here for a second, but he uses the idea of whispering the Shema as a way of ensuring two things. Number one, that everybody will say all the words, and number two, everybody will have kavana, right? What does it mean for me to actually say all the words of Shema out loud? It means I'm bothering you, right? Because unless we're saying every word together at the exact same pace, which is another actual performance of the Shema that went down another path of Jewish history, you're fundamentally messing up your neighbor. So when I get into a world where I'm trying to say the Shema out loud as a way of satisfying the Tanaitic requirement, I'm actually disrupting my neighbor who's trying to do the same thing, but not in the exact same moment. And then you've actually gotten a situation in which Rav Hai says it's better to whisper it. Then you get to these sort of halfway solutions in which, well, we'll say the 6 words of the Shema out loud, but we'll whisper the rest of the Shema. These are the ways in which even the idea of saying the Shema as a declarative experience where I'm trying to do something with words gets tempered over history in a sort of example of aesthetics are not objective. The Shema isn't always out loud. And you have the same thing with the Amida, which is even more striking since it's known as Tfilah B'Lachash. And we have the proof text from Chana herself, which goes back to Tanaitic times. But you have a statement in the Yerushalmi that simply reports, Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, Mitzale Bakala. Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda would say the Amida out loud, period. That was his practice, right? It's like, I didn't keep Shabbos, Lavia. But it's like, you have some very strong Tanaitic approach. But when you get to the world of aesthetics, you really can't necessarily legislate that in an ultimate way, I'm arguing here. And then you have sort of another example of this, where there's a reason given. Rabbi Yonah when he would pray the Amida in synagogue, he would indeed do it in a whisper. But when he would pray the Amida in his house, he would pray out loud until all the members of his house learned the Amida from him. So what's the goal of saying the Amida out loud? It's an educational goal, right? How could I ever know what the Amida said if everybody's always saying it quietly? So I have to say it out loud as a way of educating other people. And this approach actually illustrates a split. These are 2 examples from the Yerushalmi. In Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, you have 2 different approaches to the Amida. It's actually encoded in the Chilukim, in this Gaonic work that describes the difference between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. In the Chilukim, it simply says, Anshe Mizrach mipalel Adam Yudchet Brachot Belachash. In the people in the east, that is Bavel, they would say it in a whisper. Ubenei Eretz Yisrael, B'kol Ram Lihargil Ha'am. But Eretz Yisrael would say it Kol Ram, out loud. Why? In order to inculcate the people. Right? That was their educational approach. And if you weren't saying it out loud, you couldn't actually get that benefit done. Bavel takes it in a whole other direction where they basically say, Shmiya kolo betfilato hareze mikatnei amunah. Who is somebody who says the words out loud in the Amida? There's somebody of little faith. Maybe getting back to the idea of if I whisper something, I have faith that God can hear me without getting to the level of God being far away, right? Having little faith. God is farther away from me, and therefore I have to speak up, as it were. But you can see how this went in totally different directions, Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, about how the silent Amida wasn't actually silent in Eretz Yisrael. Getting back to the idea of the objectivity of aesthetics is very difficult, even for prayers that we assume are the most objective in terms of their aesthetic performance. Now, I want to just offer one conclusion around this issue of aesthetics, and then to finish with some suggestions about our modern prayer space. 2 points of guidance when analyzing the aesthetic of prayer. It's worthwhile examining the impact not only of the individual aesthetic choices, but also the emotional effect of the string of aesthetics. In other words, there's something very powerful in that shift that arises from a loud recitation of the Shema and its surrounding blessings, moving to the whispered Amidah, right? Although these prayers were originally distinct, at least at the time of Rabbi Yochanan, they were mushed together in the morning and at night. And so what you end up having is an aesthetic experience that is larger than the sum of its parts, right? When you have the Shema out loud and the Amida quietly and you put them together, you're actually moving in some emotional distance from what it means to be loud, what it means to be quiet, all like that. Whereas Joey probably will instruct us next week, what is the sound of the after the song ends, how that impacts how the song was, right? How can I understand the volume in light of the quietness? And my own personal experience of that is talk about sacrificing your values to go be in an aesthetically pleasing davening environment. When I was at the Kotel once, I went there for Nate's davening. That is to say, the davening that is the earliest possible davening that you could do because it coincides the Amida with the sunrise. And it was this incredible experience. You know, if you've been to the Kotel, that there's like 13 different minyanim that are going on all at once, all in this cacophonous blur that the 19th century reformers would have hated. And finally, at the moment of Nate, which everybody had on their iPhone before iPhone, but you know what I mean. At the exact moment of Nate, all the minyanim caught up to each other. Everybody at the Kotel was totally silent, and you could hear the birds chirping. Right? That moving from that noise, that cacophonous noise, to silence is very powerful, regardless of what was being said. And I think that that's something to pay attention to in the aesthetics, which is to say, when you're thinking about the aesthetics that are inherently subjective, what does it mean to string together numerous aesthetics, and in what way do we pay attention to that or not? Now, another way of evaluating the question of aesthetics is this: is it in service of kavanah, or is there something else going on here? Right? Let's just talk about for 1 second the problem of pace. Okay? Is the issue of the aesthetic issue of pace is one that's always in debate, and it's not just an issue of beginners and advanced people. I'll bring you this quote from Menachem Lanzano, who was 16th century prophet. He says, "I know for myself that even though I am fluent in speech and able to speak articulately, I cannot keep up with the speed of the congregational service." Right? It's not about tshuva. Okay, this is a guy who knows how to daven, and he basically is saying, "You guys are running roughshod over me." Okay, and as opposed to you have reported in Sefer HaMinagot, a medieval work, one should pray speedily and say everything he possibly can in one breath. In this way, he will not lose concentration. Okay? So the slow daveners have their support, the fast daveners have their support, but I would say only in a mode where you're ultimately looking to what is the service of the aesthetics. The aesthetics is in service of what? For both of them, it is presumably something towards kavanah. Okay? So if all I get from my fast davening is a quicker davening, I'm not necessarily in the same category as the aesthetics that's being described here in Sefer HaMinagot. In other words, if I'm using the aesthetics only to a utilitarian end, right? If I'm dragging out the service because I don't have any control over time, as opposed to I'm dragging out the service because I think there's some value to repetition, then I would say you have to go back and check about your aesthetics. Or to put it one way, we may disagree about what a positive aesthetic is, but we may actually agree more often than not on what everybody can say is a negative aesthetic. It may not be the ones we think are obvious, like a 19th century temple, but it may be something that is common to all of us. Now, to conclude, I wanted to basically offer some thoughts on what it means to be a member of the Kahal. And here I'm not really speaking to you, I'm speaking to me because I do all these things all the time. But I think that ultimately when you're talking about an aesthetic environment, the one that Heschel was really driving towards, you have to take into account the way in which you contribute or do not contribute to the aesthetics. And here I'm not talking about the way in which you relate to your Siddur. I'm simply talking about the way in which you build or take away from the aesthetic environment. Now, I would say that the modern synagogue is often plagued by an overlay of silence. And if this is done on purpose, right, with the goal of decorum as the end, I'm sympathetic. But I actually fear it's more of an expression of what Heschel called religious bashfulness, right? On the issue of volume, he counseled us as follows. Let us learn how to chant our prayers. It is one of our tragedies that we do not know how to appreciate the very soul of our ancient speech, the chant, and instead have adopted a pompous, monotonous manner. Let us try to recapture the last traces of our ancient chant. Let us learn to express what we say. Right? Heschel is begging for people to mumble, to chant, to bring some life and expression to what it means to sit in the kahal. He's not talking to the campers. Right? He's talking to the people in the chair themselves. And I think that although you may argue for an aesthetic that is more silent, we often default into silence because of the bashfulness issue and not out of a purposefulness of trying to build a particular decorum. Now, the corollary to a silent congregation is one that's overly cynical, as I mentioned last week, which uses the moments of tefillah to talk or read. Now, the upside of that is I feel very at home in my space of tefillah. So at home that I'm going to open up a book and start reading it in the middle. Or I'm going to start having my kiddush a little early with you, like, during whatever, Ashrei. Now, I think that, again, here I'm going to put myself in a not popular camp, even with some of my colleagues at the yeshiva. But I would say that ultimately, if you're trying to build an aesthetic of davening, all that stuff cuts against the aesthetic. Okay? Unless you can argue to me that the aesthetic of everybody plugging out of tefillah is what you're going for, then I would say that the idea of I can sit and read my book, of course I'm studying, right? Or I can stand over here and talk to somebody about something, even if it's important, is ultimately cutting against the idea of the aesthetic of the prayer space. Let's put it this way. If Rav Hai was willing to take the Tannaitic prescription on the Shema and say that you have to whisper the Shema for the purposes of Kavanah, I would say that talking is going to have a hard time making it into the canon when really we're trying to get to a world where Kavanah is disturbed by people's ambient noise. And I would extend this to posture as well. The posture of the Amida is clearly delineated in the standing. I think it's a question, Rabbi Friedel once asked this question to Kesher a number of years ago, which really stuck with me. No, the question isn't why do we stand for the Amida? The question is why do we sit for anything else? Right? Why is sitting, especially in a world before chairs, right? But why are we sitting for any moment of prayer? Prayer is something that engages your body. And when you're sitting, and not only that, you're sitting the way we sit, right? You're slumped over, the chair's very comfortable, so you're leaning back, you got your legs crossed, right? I sort of imagine that the ideal chair for a synagogue service is one that's just uncomfortable. It's actually what I like about the pews. You don't want to sit down in the pews that long. It's uncomfortable. I mean, not only the padding, but okay, without the padding, right? You should be sort of like ready at a moment's notice to leap up because you're actually trying to engage your body, and sitting is a compromise in a way that standing may not be. I think that I'll say one last thing about sitting and then conclude. I think that basically there's also the question of where you sit. And here I would say that, my colleague Joey has taught me a lot about this, but I'll actually mention my brother talking to me about the Carlebach Shul. My brother used to daven often at the Carlebach Shul, and he said to me when I went there one time, he said, if you don't go up to the front, you're missing the entire thing. And it is actually a shul where it's constructed where all the action is in the front, okay? Now, I would say that's true for pretty much any service, okay? Like I had the practice for a while when I was going to B'nai Jeshurun. You sit right in the front. First of all, there's always a seat, okay? So you can always get a seat in the front. But the experience of being in the front is just so different from the experience of being in the back. It's an emotional readiness that's completely other than I'm making my quick getaway, right? Which is all of what we're trying to do when we sit in the back. And I think fundamentally, if you're there for tefillah, you've got to be ready to experience it. In for a penny, in for a pound. Sit in the front, okay? So I think that there's some possibility of when we look at our own behavior as a member of the kahal, and the way in which we use our voice to either join in with the tefillot or to cut against it by talking. We use our body either to sit slumping or to stand at attention or to sit in a particular area of the room. We are actually creating that prayer aesthetic in a way that we may not always be cognizant of the way in which we're contributing to that ultimate space. There's a lot of other aesthetic issues that we don't have time to get into, but I bring this as a way of saying that there are certainly no objective aesthetic approaches to tefillah, but let's at least be cognizant of the way in which aesthetics can both launch us from the words of prayer to an affective place, an emotional space, and the way in which we bring our use of voice and our use of body and our own understanding of where we sit in the tefillah space as a way of contributing to the aesthetic that's trying to be achieved, as opposed to cutting across from it. I'll just end with this last quote from Larry Hoffman from a great book called The Art of Public Prayer, Not for Clergy Only, in which he says, it is not true that worship is banal because its words are sterile. It is true that the words sound sterile because the worship is banal. In what way are we going to create a world in which worship is no longer something that we dread? Worship is something that we are actually contributing to. We're unlocking both the intellectual approach to worship and the emotional approach. And I'll end with a pitch for my colleague Joey. Next week, what would a series like this be if it was simply people talking at you? We're going to have a more engaged and interactive experience of what it means to approach music as one of the core elements of the aesthetics of prayer. Thank you. We have time for a few questions.
Thank you.
I'm going to just ask that you use the mic so that the folks on the internet can hear.
Now the pressure is on.
Only if words make sense.
Well, that's kind of my question. So comparing this with last week's talk about the importance of the literary intertextual approach, which sort of requires a kavanah that is about thinking of, like, you have to think. And then this approach, which to me feels fun also, but fundamentally different, and then it sort of asks you to turn off thinking and let the experience be aesthetic. How do those things work in tandem? And do you have to sort of favor one over another when you're praying, and do you kind of choice to do that?
Right. I think that my teacher in all things tefillah, Rabbi Eben Leder, once we were at a tefillah retreat together, Hadar organized. He davened Kabbalat Shabbat. There were 60 people on the retreat, and afterwards he was reflecting on it, and he said, 60 people, 60 different tefillah experiences. And that was very powerful for me, because what it means is I and you are not having the same experience. Now for you, the words might be the roadblock where an intellectual solution might be the way to go. And for me, the words, I either have a problem or I don't have a problem with them, but I'm not going anywhere until I have the emotional access point. I think for a lot of people, we often hide our emotional disconnect in the intellectual disconnect. That's to say, we're not willing to admit that the emotions are not actually being activated on in the service, and we sort of blame that on the words, right? That was Kaplan's approach, which may actually be true for many people. For me personally, it's not the case. In other words, when I would teach all those shiurim about how to pray what you don't believe, at the end of the day, it wasn't helping me daven. But what would help me daven is when I would get into an aesthetic environment that actually called upon the emotional side of the words. So I would say that, I would say in some ways, whatever works, or whatever's blocking you, let's work on that. And I think that, it's interesting, Yosef Dan, when he's writing about these Hasidei Ashkenaz, he's not willing to go as far as to say that when they were saying all the words of Torah Yisrael, they had in their mind all of the gematria that was going on and all the cross references. He basically was willing to, to admit, I don't know if they were doing that when they prayed. That's how they understood the prayer when they were thinking about it. But I'm not sure ultimately that prayer is always about thinking.
So coming back to what you talked about at the beginning of the shiur, you talked about it in the stuff, like all the repetition and kind of like a mantra. But is there any evidence that when the Tanaim or whoever was codifying the prayer book was doing that they had that in mind? Like it's clearly poetic, but how much do we know if whether or not the people that actually wrote the prayer book put together wanted that to happen?
Right. So the question of whether or not we know whether the mystics were able to state out, my mystical approach is one in which I'm going to bring you alliterative words that are meant to open up an emotional side of you. Nobody says that out straightforward. That's an interpretation that that people who study mystical texts are bringing to the table. I think it's not a totally far-fetched one, only in the sense of both Rabbi Hanina's objection of how could you ever describe God, so what use is it to keep piling on the adjectives, and also sort of the evidence, right? The evidence is on the table in which you can imagine the ways in which people reciting these texts were able to get to spiritual states that are simply beyond the sort of literal interpretation. And for that we do have evidence in the sense that people saw the words as a vehicle of getting somewhere. It was an elevating, it's a complicated textual collection because it's Yordei Merkava, going down to the Merkava, which is the heavenly chariot, which is a little bit unusual because you imagine them going up. But ultimately, you definitely have practices that were meant to move people in a sort of imaginative state where they would get into the heavenly chamber and start to experience the angelic worship as sort of an onlooker or a participant. So you're not getting to the point of, and that's why I use the mem, explicitly. But I think that there certainly is a different experience of those words that that these mystics were using to get somewhere, both in their head and in their prayers. Reduce the value of words so much. Please, David.
Maybe this is more of a rhetorical question. It's not what Ben was just saying than an actual question, but I think to the same extent, I always wondered in school, like as a kid in English class, I was learning about a poem, and we talk about alliteration and accents, and it would be like, okay, but did the poet really sit down and think about what this would sound like when we said out loud? Just as they probably did, and maybe that was unclear what they were trying to do, maybe that was the whole point, I don't know. And it's probably very simple as a poet, but I sort of have always imagined it as the same thing kind of passages like that where it's like, the cottage, there's clearly going to be a conflict there. But with that, like the first thing on the author's mind, I don't know, but
Right.
really it's like part of it.
Right. I think the poetic process is one in which, even in modern day poetry, we're not always aware of the ways in which we ourselves, as the poet, are using some of these tools. It's a complicated and I would say multiple meaning experience, both to say a poem and to write a poem. And we may not always be in touch with the ways in which we're drawing upon that more affective side. You can see something like Lecha Dodi, where I think it's clearly, meant to be in that direction, but maybe it just comes out that way, right? It's not necessarily always front of mind, but I would say that it's not impossible that it was, part of at least the ambiance of what it meant to write a prayer when you're talking about an emotional approach to God as opposed to a purely intellectual approach to God. Oh, yeah, Michael.
My wife has an interesting take on Judaism. She claims it's not a very user-friendly sort of religion. And you can take tefillah as an example because in the past two lectures you've given us so many different things to think about, when we're doing our tefillah. Think about the word, you have to think about the way it relates to Tanakh. Now, this week you can think about the way the words sound, the numerical values of the words, all of these different things. In other religions that, shall we say, are more do they have other approaches to the way in which there is a prayer that perhaps reaches a broader set of people in perhaps a less, I don't know,
Right. I mean,
compare and contrast.
Right. I'm no expert in world religions, although I will say, we definitely are on the longer end of the service options out there. I think that it's interesting. We spent some time on the Kedusha D'Yotzer. Those texts, those mem texts, both come from Kedusha D'Yotzer. Whole scholarly debate about to what extent those are paralleled in early Christian prayer. That is to say, the Kedusha, the reciting over and over again of the word Kadosh, quoting from Isaiah 6, is found not only in Jewish prayer but also in early Christian prayer. Now, the way that we have developed the Siddur is probably different ultimately than the way that other religions are using text, either from an intellectual standpoint or from an emotional standpoint. And, I think that, look, that may be our burden to bear. I also think that it's, we often have this problem of defining, well, what is a Jewish value, or what is uniquely Jewish about this community, or you get into these things that, well, if I'm good to my neighbor, I visit the sick. It's like, well, so do the other religions, right? But in this case, I would say, you know what? This is ours. Nobody else has Sur Yisrael with 14 letters and 600,000 Jews leaving Egypt. And I think that there's something, that you can take some pride in that and not always see it as a burden. I think it's, we have it as our approach to the divine. And certainly from the mystical texts, you see people who are using that approach to great effect. So it's not to say that it's the only way to approach the divine, but it is the Jewish way. This one I have no doubt on. This, tefillah is Jewish. And you're not going to get to a place in which you might confuse it for another religion, even if other religions, which as an aside have spread much more widely than Judaism, may have other approaches to prayer, or both on the intellectual and emotional sides. Yeah, just raise your hand. All right.
good question. People have all these rhythms that you go through that are essentially rhyming on the Mishana, Mishana, Mishana. Well, Mishana, Mishana, that. So you think of like Psalm 150. Hallelujah. You can go back and forth on it. I sort of find myself.
Thank God those texts are long enough that you can both get into the sort of syllable side of, Huya Anenu and the meaning side of it. Maybe this gets back to Ben's point, where you're not limited to the mantra only side of things. And you actually could experience some imaginative connection to a God who answered Abraham, Avinu, and you're sort of moving in and out of that intellectual space. Whether that was on purpose, in other words, whether that's different from the Om practice, where you actually have I'm moving a little bit from the intellect as we're breaking it down, to the emotional. That's an interesting question. I don't know if that was sort of like on purpose. As I said, it's not reading the phone book. It's not the Om approach, which from a purely mantra space is more effective. But I think that clearly the word means something to some extent. It's interesting. In the magical texts, you get to the gibberish level. Specifically when you're talking about the names of angels or names of God that are used in magical forms that are just simply a string of letters that are not meant to be understood. And that might be the line. Sorry?
Alice in Wonderland, Jabberwocky.
Right, exactly. Alice in Wonderland, Jabberwocky. Right, exactly. But and that maybe that's the line between the magic and religion when it gets to our specific circles of text, where there is something valued in moving beyond just. There has to be some esoteric or some interpretive. Not sure. Yeah, please. In other words, how am I able to, if I'm in the emotional side of my head, how am I actually noticing the difference between prayer A and prayer B? Right. I mean, it's a good question also. I would say, how do you experience the difference between Ein Kelohenu and Aleinu? Let's give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. Let's say you experience anything for either of them, right? Is there a way in which you could actually move, is there something where, okay, the poetry of Ein Kelohenu is different from the poetry of Aleinu. But Aleinu is a poem. If you look at it, it has very clearly defined meter, which is actually interrupted by the part where you bow in terms of just the meter side of it. But when you sort of, Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol, la'tet gedula le'yotzer breshit, shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot, right? You have the four beats, the four parts of the line. That's not the same as Ein Kelohenu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kimalkenu, right? But it's but it maybe it's accomplishing the same emotional effect. And then on the intellectual side, I would say that, so in other words, even in the emotional space, you're experiencing a difference between prayer A and prayer B. On the intellectual side, it's obviously much more varied. But once you're out of that, once you're out of that realm and into the emotional space, I would say it may be harder to detect the difference, but I would say there is a difference. I mean, it's a difference between any type of poem. What makes a poem different from another poem? They're fundamentally poems that are trying to get at something emotional, but not necessarily doing it in the same way. Yeah, pass though.
So I'm going to ask the second question. This is about a sort of fundamental assumption I think maybe we're all making, but I think you're probably making, which is about the sort of necessity of prayer in the first place. Because the last time you talked about getting people in the door, that the intellectual argument was partly getting people in the door, and today as well there was some discussion of sort of like, how do I get myself to do this? And without trying to like open up a big can of worms, I'm wondering, like, maybe not why pray, but why do you sort of want to get other people to pray?
I need all of you. No, I think that, look, there's some, I mean, Heschel was trying to get it, we talked about this a little bit last week about what is prayer. I think that fundamentally connecting with the divine, I believe, is some basic human instinct that we are trying to bring our own version of. I mean, let's put it this way: enough people in the world pray that it doesn't seem to be something that is unusual, even if Jews are the least likely to do it, let's say, in the modern period in America. And I think that, I'm sort of joking, but I actually believe in the idea of I need people to pray in order to get an aesthetic experience. You can't get somewhere totally by yourself. I mean, you can. There's a story of Rabbi Akiva who, when he was with the Kahal, he would bow more staidly. But when he was by himself, he would start off on one end of the room and end off on the other end of the room because of all the prostrations that he did. If you were prostrated, you notice that you move backwards. So there is something about what you could do on your own. But at the end of the day, I would say that there's something very powerful about saying the Shema with 1,000 people. Or there's something about being at the Kotel with those 13 different minyanim that you can go from the sound to the silence in a way with other people that you can't otherwise do. And I think that, so that's from the selfish side of things. And then I would say from the sort of, Kiruv side of things, I think it's one of the hardest things that Jews are ready to give up on prayer, 100%. They're frustrated with it. The problems that were described by Heschel and Kaplan are still the same problems, if not worse. And basically what I'm trying to propose here is a way in which we don't give up on prayer. Take Hebrew school for a second. Hebrew school, it's we're definitely upset with Hebrew schools that all they do is they teach you the words of the prayer book. Hebrew school, you should have a good time. But you know what? If you never learn the words of the prayer book, we've shut off the ability for you to pray in the way that Jews pray. Okay? Now, it's not to say that you can never make it up. But at the end of the day, there's something very powerful about the way Jews pray. And I sort of feel bad that people lose that opportunity. Or that they think that the only way that I could get at it is by cutting or rewriting or injecting some musical overlay that sort of defeats the words, or any number of other strategies that we haven't discussed here. And maybe with this I'll close. I think that I'm obviously a proponent of the minyanim as a way of approaching the divine in worship. But I would say that my thinking has certainly evolved in a way where I am much more open to any environment that is actually taking prayer seriously. Whether that's structurally more likely in something that's grassroots, or more likely in a synagogue that has professionals. If it's more likely in a place that's dingy and dark, or in a place that's well lit, I'm less and less sure. In other words, I would say my approach is now, let's try everything in every place. Because we're just basically running out of people who care about tefillah in a serious way. And I'm interested in anybody who cares about the project. So I think that I have my own aesthetic desires, and I have my own group of people that I like to pray with. But ultimately, I'm in a world where anybody who's taking this question seriously is an ally. And I think that we need as many allies as we can in order to try to solve the crisis of prayer. Thank you. Next week, Joey Weisenberg. Don't miss it.